Welcome to the Concordia Publishing House Podcast, where we consider everything in the light of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm your host, Elizabeth Pittman. The third commandment asks Christians to remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. But how is one supposed to keep it holy? And how does work, rest, and play help us do just that? Dr. Joel Biermann, author of Day 7 for Work, Rest, or Play, joins us today to talk about the Sabbath and what it means for us. Before we start our conversation with Dr. Biermann, I'd like to thank our friends at the LCMS Foundation for their support of the podcast. How can your congregation turn significant financial gifts into a long-term funding source that blesses your church for generations? The LCMS Foundation was created to provide professional investment services to LCMS churches, schools, and RSOs. They've helped hundreds of congregations create, manage, and grow endowments using investments tailored to each congregation's unique goals and needs. And now they'd like to help yours. Learn more at lcmsfoundation.org/podcast. Now on to our conversation with Dr. Joel Biermann. Dr. Biermann, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
So how does it feel to have another new book out?
It's great to have a book done. It's always a relief to put the final period on when you're writing it and then to go through the whole process. And when it's out, it's a good thing, no doubt.
So as we were talking, you were visiting us here at the office, and we were talking about the new book, Day 7. And you mentioned that unlike some of your other writing, you wrote this intentionally for a lay audience. So tell us about why you wanted to write it for a lay audience, and how did you test that you hit the mark for that lay audience?
Well, yeah, I believe, I'm firmly committed to the idea that doctrine is relevant for real life. Because if we understand doctrine is simply God's truth about how things are, then that matters for how we live our lives. It's got immediate application to everything, and I'm absolutely persuaded of that. And it's kind of my mission in the classroom and everything I teach to persuade people of that as well. I want people to recognize that doctrine is not this spiritual thing for some parts of life. It encompasses all of life. And so for me, getting doctrine accessible to real people is what it's all about. Everybody should be able to recognize, oh, God has something to say about this. Yep. So I've always tried to do that when I write. The previous books I had worked on, I made an effort to try to say, okay, I want to aim this at an audience that could be, college age, sharp people, but it should be accessible to everybody. And my dad read through my first two books, and he concluded by saying, I don't think you did that. This is not accessible to the average person, and it's at too high of a level. And I thought, okay, fine. And so he told me that after both of my books, Case for Character and then Holy Citizens. And so this book I tried even harder. And to be honest, one of the techniques I used when I was working on this book to maybe kind of help rein me in, because an academic is always trying to figure out how to defend what he's saying. Everything you guys say, you've got to defend and give evidence. And so it leads to a peculiar kind of writing, a style. So I made an effort this time to limit my footnotes. And so I'm not going to footnote. I'm just going to say stuff and not back it up. I'm just going to make assertions and not back it up. And so that's what I did. And it helped a lot, and it made things a little more smooth. And when my dad read it, he said, yeah, it's not bad. And so there was my stamp of approval.
So I have to confess that when I opened it, I did see a few footnotes in there. And so when I was in law school, I had a professor for constitutional law, and almost from day one, it was drilled into us that what's in the footnotes is probably the most important thing on the page. So when I see a footnote, I go to that first. So I have to confess, I did that. There weren't many, but when I flipped through, I did go to look at the footnotes.
Well, yeah, no, and what you were taught is exactly right. And I have to get my students to realize this. Footnotes are part of the manuscript. You got to read them. And people choose not to. But so anyway, for me, the mark of just limit the footnoting helped me a lot, just to kind of keep my focus and keep the continuity, I think. So that's what I did.
All right. So what's your goal for this book? What do you hope people take away from it?
Yeah, this book, and I've reflected on this just a little bit. This is by far my favorite book that I've written so far, mostly because I think it's absolutely relevant and absolutely necessary for everybody to consider these things, because it gets to the core of what it actually means to be human, what it means to live our lives in this world, and what it means to live them in a way that is really meaningful and frankly delightful, enjoyable. That's kind of the tenor of the book, is just injecting a little more joy into life and recognizing that the wholeness of life is meant to be suffused with this delight in living as God's creature. And so my goal is that I want people to read this and then say, wow, that's got impact for how I live today. And I can immediately kind of maybe think about things a little differently, or shift how I operate, or change my attitude a little bit and bring more joy into how I operate. That's exactly what I'm looking for.
Well, it was a daunting task. And I think you mentioned it in the beginning, like, this is a big task, as I'm talking about, like, this is what it means to be human. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my topic is Sabbath. And, when I was telling people 3 or 4 years ago I wanted to write a book about Sabbath, I would get the kind of blank look and the eye rolls, like, what on earth? How is that even relevant? Who cares? How arcane is that? But I'm absolutely persuaded that this is exceedingly relevant. I try to make the case in the book, and I hope I do. But yeah, you're right. This is the whole point, is that this matters for real life.
Do you think so? You talk in the early part of the book about how Lutherans tend to have often a different view of the Sabbath than other Christians, in that we've gone to church, we've checked the box, now we're on to other things. And I know at least in my house, it will play out like that, where we'll have arguments where my husband will say, all right, boys, we're going to do some chores and some yard work today. And the boys will echo back with, but it's the Sabbath, it's Sunday, we need to rest. So do you think that some of that perspective is why people might have looked at you a little funny, of like, what do you mean you're going to do a whole book on the Sabbath and what that looks like?
No, I think so. And you're quite right. Lutherans have a kind of a strange niche within Christendom on the Sabbath thing, because we just treat it very differently than others. Most traditions are very concerned about it. It's one of the 10 commandments. And so if it's one of the 10, for crying out loud, pay attention to it. But we follow Luther, and Luther, frankly, was a little bit dismissive of it. His whole approach was, Sabbath, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? Go to church and pay attention. And that's the end of it. I was like, okay, I can do that. And so, yeah, it gets kind of weird. But when you actually look at what it's saying, it's like, is that really what's going on there? I guess so. That's what Luther said. And so that puts us in kind of a funny spot with the rest of the church. That's quite true.
So tell us what the rest of the church tends to think when they're looking at how they look at the Sabbath.
Yeah, Rome always looks at it the way they do everything. Here's a commandment, do it the right way and earn God's grace and keep yourself in the right good of the church. And so they kind of basically come down to, you got to go to Mass once a week. And that's kind of what their move. But it's all about fulfilling the law. That's where Rome comes down. The rest of our Protestant brothers and sisters, they have a tendency to kind of operate in more the idea that, hey, this means Sabbath needs to be kept. And if you're a strict Calvinist, that means no work. That's what you do. And I'm reminded, I don't know how many people have read these, but I read them when I was young and my kids read them, but the Little House on the Prairie series. Mm-hmm. And in those books, you remember Laura Ingalls hated Sundays, just hated them, because her dad was a strict disciplinarian on the Sabbath. And what Sabbath meant was you sit in a chair and you think about the Bible and you think about God, nothing else, not even playing. And it's like, and so they hated it. And that's not uncommon. I mean, those are still around some. But then you have the others who are always trying to figure out that, well, if it doesn't mean that, what does it mean? Maybe we need to have a different routine. Maybe we need to have a different way of operating. And that's what is most common. How do you make Sabbath different? How to make Sabbath special? How to make Sunday stand out? And everybody's always worrying about how to salvage the Sabbath and make something different about the Sabbath, and how to Christianize this old Jewish thing. Luther's attitude was, hey, it's Sabbath, and it doesn't matter because it's the 10 Commandments, which don't apply to us anymore, which sounds, whoa, he said that, but he did. And so that's kind of how he approached it. But the rest of the church is trying to figure out what to do with it. And that's part of what drove me to write this book as well, is that so many of the books I've read on Sabbath tend to zero in on how do we as Christians make the day special. And I've realized it misses the whole entire point. And that's what really got me going, was I think Sabbath is far more foundational, far more fundamental than just what do you do on Sundays or Saturdays, and how do you make that different? It's a lot more going on than that.
So what are most people, and I think you've started to touch on this, but how are people missing the point, and what are they getting wrong? And then pivot to, where does work, rest, and play all come in as the way to look at it?
Yeah, without giving away the entire book, but I will. The whole point is what Sabbath is about in the context of the 10 Commandments. You see, my approach was to say, The Ten Commandments are an expression of the natural law. They're an expression of the way that God built the world to work. It's just the way things are. The commandments are not this imposed list of rules that God came up with to make life miserable. They're just the way the world works. It's how things go. And so the commandments just express that. So we should be asking the question in every commandment, what's the core of this about? Which is exactly what Luther does on all of the Ten Commandments, except for the Sabbath commandment. On that one, he kind of minimizes it to just go to church. But see, if you ask the question, what's the core of this? I believe it's not about knocking off work for one day a week because you're tired. I believe that the core of it is grounded in God's creative action in the 6 days of creation, and then he rests on the seventh day. Why? Not because he's tired, not because he needs to catch his breath, but because he is celebrating the work he has done and establishing for us a pattern. And there's the key, that the whole point is we live our lives aimed at Sabbath, which is the fulfillment of God's creation. And Sabbath, rightly understood, is simply, I'll put it this way, it's living in tune with what God has done. It's living in tune with him, living in tune with the creation, and delighting in what it means to be a creature. That's Sabbath. It's exemplified in good worship, and it's exemplified in being together with friends and family and just celebrating times, typical kinds of Sunday activities. But that should spill out into all the rest of life. And when you see it this way, there's no longer this battle between work and rest, work and rest. So Sabbath means rest is important. No, Sabbath means we should be living our whole lives in tune with God's purposes, including our work life. So there's a Sabbath way of going about work, and there's a work way of even doing Sunday. So when your husband suggests to your kids that we should do some jobs on Sunday, no problem. That's fine. And so your kids lose on that one. And
Darren thanks you, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. Your kids will be less excited about that. But this is exactly the point, that Sabbath is this really sweeping idea of living life according to God's purpose, according to God's telos, the goal, the thing we're aiming at. That's what Sabbath is about. And so work fits into that. And our rest, yeah, it's part of that as well. But rest is a whole lot different than just equation with Sabbath. There's more going on.
So what else is going on with rest?
Well, you see, rest should be rightly understood in a couple of ways. One is just, yeah, our bodies need physical rest, but we need physical rest more than once a week. I need it every day. And I contend, I actually make this point in the book, that our need for rest is really dealt with every single night when we have our need for sleep. And sleep is this huge mystery. I actually spent half a chapter on the mystery of sleep because I find it so fascinating, that we have to sleep every day. And if you push past that, you start to just not function well. I mean, 24 hours without sleep, we start to feel it. 36 hours without sleep, you're getting really weird. And, beyond that, they actually have documented 5 days without sleep and you're basically dead. So we need sleep. And so this rest is far more than just, once a week we need to rest our bodies. No, we need to rest our bodies every single day. And so the weekly thing is something else. There's more to it than that. That's my point. So that's why I'm saying, yes, physical rest is a piece of it, but more important is the rest from a spiritual, theological standpoint, which means things are right. We're not having to do something. We're at rest. And so that's why the writer of Hebrews says a Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. Well, he's talking about the ultimate rest, the fulfillment when Christ comes again, the eschatological, new heavens and new earth, everything back in the new kingdom. There's the rest we're aiming at. And so Sabbath is meant to point to that. It's a little precursor of what's coming. It's a foretaste of where we're going to be. And we do that in worship, and we do that in our daily lives, of how we operate, living in tune. We're delighting in what it means to be Christian and creaturely, and looking forward to that fulfillment that's coming.
So you said something where you mentioned that Luther, when it comes to the third commandment, was just kind of to the point, honor the Sabbath day, go to church. If somebody were to come to you after hearing you kind of expand on this a little bit, and they say to you, so did Luther get it wrong?
Yeah.
How do you react? How do you respond to that?
No, that's a fair question. I've been asked that before. My response to that would be to say, I think I'll fudge a little bit, but I'll give you a clean answer eventually. But see, historically, you need to pay attention to why did Luther do what he did? And I think there's a huge clue there historically when you look into what's going on, because there was a segment of the Reformation that started very early on, right there, even in Wittenberg, where you have, I'm drawing a blank on my names here. You have the Reformation already picking up steam of kind of going in a full tilt. Everything Roman is bad. We got to get rid of it. And even this idea that we got to recapture the full biblical way of operating, and we got to do things the way the Bible did that. So it was Karlstadt, got my name here, who said, hey, if you're going to be a Christian, you got to keep all of Old Testament rules. And so you've got to keep the Sabbath, which meant you got to literally not do any work. And this, he also went to the graven images, and he cleared out the church in Wittenberg and all this horrendous stuff. And so that was Karlstadt. Luther hated that, absolutely hated it. He had zero use for Karlstadt. And you read his interactions with Karlstadt, and Luther was just harsh to this guy because he saw it as so damning to the church. That's what I'm convinced of. And so when Luther was dealing with Karlstadt, he had very little patience, because basically Karlstadt should have known better. He was a better theologian than that, and he's gutting the gospel. Luther hates all those things. You don't do that. And so when Luther's working on the small catechism, I'm convinced he didn't want to give Karlstadt one bit of room. And so what's the best way to gut Karlstadt? Sabbath? Don't even worry about it. Just go to church. There you go. So much for you, Karlstadt. And so that's what Luther's up to. He's just trashing Karlstadt's entire position, and he does it very effectively. I mean, we have learned well, and none of us are running around thinking, oh, I think I need to keep Sabbath. That doesn't happen in our midst, so Luther was quite successful. But in the process, did Luther pay as much attention to maybe some of the wider things going on here, and especially Jesus dealing with what's going on in Sabbath in the New Testament and how it has happening? And I think there's more to it than that. So I don't think Luther was wrong in what he did, and it's quite appropriate for his time. But is there more that we can gain and apply in our context and for our benefit today? And I would say, yeah, a great deal.
So in the Old Testament, how did the Israelites understand and observe the Sabbath?
Yeah. So what God did early on was he had this idea that Sabbath is just sort of this wired reality that creatures should live in tune with their creator and with one another and delight. That to me is the guts of this thing. So then what God did was very early on, he attached to that a significance to say, hey, every Sabbath day, the day that I rested, I want you to rest. And we're going to make this real clear. No work. Now, in the ancient world, that was a big gamble. To actually take a day off of work, you work to survive. And we forget that in the 21st century, how much you have to work just to live. Our lives are far more comfortable and far easier. But in the ancient world, to not work was just an inherent risk. And it meant, in a sense, you got to depend on me. And to me, that's kind of what's going on here as well, is this sense of creaturely dependence upon God is implicit throughout the whole Sabbath thing. You're a creature, don't forget it. You need me for everything. And so by forcing Israel not to work, they were reminded, whoa, we're completely dependent upon God. And it's good for us to reset and remember that. There's also the fact that no one else in the ancient world ever had Sabbath. And so this made Israel really distinct and helped them to remember who they were as God's people. So that was kind of what it did for Israel. So in the New Testament, what you see going on is Jesus makes very clear this not working isn't a big deal. And he just diminishes that and dismisses it, because what he's saying is, hey, Sabbath, it's me. I'm Sabbath. I'm the fulfillment of God's plan. I'm the creature being what he's supposed to be. I'm creation functioning the way it should. I'm in tune. I'm Sabbath fulfillment. So I can do what I want because I'm Sabbath fulfillment. And so you see this, the hang up on work is just completely missing the point. And even the hang up on a particular day, Jesus makes clear, is kind of missing the point. And that becomes, I would argue, very explicit as you read through the gospel, especially of Luke, and how in Luke's gospel, these Sabbath interactions of Jesus and the Pharisees are deliberate and intentional, and they're making a very strong point. Even though we kind of maybe miss it, I think it was in the forefront of Luke's whole way of operating. And I make that case in the book as well.
So what can we today learn from that disruption that Jesus provided in the New Testament for how we approach Sabbath today?
Yeah, don't get legalistic about it. Don't get hung up on, I got to do this, I can't do this, what are the rules? You're missing the point. You're asking questions like that, you're already missing the point. And so it's not about, you can't do this, you must do this, follow these rules, always do this. No, the whole point of us is saying Sabbath is meant for us. And this is Jesus. The Sabbath is not made for man. man's not made for the Sabbath is made for us. It's for our benefit. And that's why God institutes it. And so we should be looking at Sabbath as this delightful reality that is the culmination and, in a sense, the aim of our human existence that helps to bring clarity to our very existence.
You mentioned, so in the title, it's for work, rest, or play. We talked about rest. We've touched on work. Where does play come into this? How does play feed into our understanding of Sabbath?
Yeah, play is really important. And I read a little essay by, of all people, Peter Berger, the cultural sociologist from 100, not quite 100 years ago, but last century. And he has this called Rumor of Angels. There's this little piece he wrote. And he is kind of one of the early guys recognizing sort of the problem of a disenchantment of the Western world, which has become very hip way of talking about disenchanting and re-enchanting everything, and everybody is trying to re-enchant the world now. But Berger was doing this already 100 years ago, thinking about these things and this kind of disenchantment. And he argues that play, and it really is kind of an enlightening essay, that play is actually a critical part of what it means to be a creature, and especially a human creature, because play reminds us that there are things far more important than just surviving and the things that we can accomplish. When you play, you're living in, and he even makes the argument that when you play, you're living in a kind of precursor little foretaste of eternity, which is a crazy thought, but he's right. Because see, when you play a game, time doesn't matter anymore. The time that matters is the time on the clock in the football game, or what inning it is. It doesn't matter that it's 9:05 at night. What matters is what inning is it. Time becomes suspended in a game. And in a game, the rules are the rules of the game. The rest of the rules of life no longer apply. Now we're in the game, and those are the rules. That's really insightful. And it helps us remember that we then live our lives always dependent on what's going on around us, and remembering that there are things that are bigger than and more important than even just the rules we live by. And games and play kind of help us remember that. They remind us of our creatureliness and of our dependence upon God. There's a lot of great things going on at play.
No, and I think at play too, it calms you down, kind of like rest lets you settle down. It helps your body relax, and it doesn't hurt to laugh.
Exactly. And see, this also helps because a lot of times Christians especially get really hung up on, now, is this work or is this a hobby? Or is this play? And the divisions between play and work and hobby get really blurred. I mean, people invest a lot of effort, a lot of energy into play. Well, then it's not really play anymore. Well, yeah, it is. Because you see, the amount of energy you expend is not the point. The bigger point is, what's your motive in doing it? What's your purpose? And one of the really central aspects of play is and hear this right, is the purposelessness of it. And see, that's the really kind of cool thing. When you do work, it's for a purpose. There's something you want to get done. I'm getting this job done. I'm accomplishing this. When you play, in the pure sense of play, there is no purpose beyond the play itself, beyond the game. And see, that's why even people, when they instrumentalize play, so they get exercise and stay healthy, you're kind of ruining it. The point of play is you play for the sheer pleasure of the play itself. It has no other purpose. And it's the very purposelessness of it that is the beauty of it. See, worship is the same way. Worship is just, we get together and worship. What's the point? Worship is the point. There is no purpose.
And it's really hard for us today in today's society to do that and say, I'm just going to go do this for the pure fun of it, and not to have to check certain boxes or to achieve something.
That's exactly right. Especially in our 21st century American world, we are all about what's pragmatic, what gets something done, what's effective, what's productive. Everything has to be productive, and play is not productive. That's the whole point. That's why it's good, because you do something that's purely unproductive and you delight in it. Yep.
So everybody's going to go take a play break this afternoon, I hope.
Exactly.
Go play a game. So how does the Sabbath give us a glimpse into what our eternal life with Christ will be when we finally reach that day?
Right. And this is really interesting, I think, because Sabbath is the culmination of God's work of creation. He creates on 6 discrete days, setting a pattern and a rhythm. And then on day 7, the work is complete. And so he rests, which means no more new creation. He's delighting. And it's important to remember that Adam and Eve are created on day 6 go to bed that night, wake up in the morning, or they go, the sun sets and it becomes the first Sabbath, they haven't done a stitch of work and they're already Sabbathing. So they're not tired. Sabbath is more than this. And so then Sabbath really illustrates the idea of creation rightly aligned. Adam and Eve are living in tune with God and with the rest of creation, with each other, with themselves. Everything's in tune. Sabbath is a celebration of everything's just the way it's supposed to be. That's what eternity is going to be. That's what the new creation is going to be. That's the eternal kingdom Christ is bringing when all things are made right. That's what we're looking forward to. So Sabbath is a foretaste of that. And this is exactly the move the writer to Hebrews makes in chapters 4 and 5. This is a harbinger of what's more to come. And so this then can teach us a little bit more about eternity as well. Because see, Sabbath lived well is not the exclusion of work. We haven't touched on this, but I make a pretty strong argument in the book that humans are built by God for work. So work is not imposed on us. It's not incidental to our creatureliness. It's part of who we are as creatures. This is also a foreign idea. Most of us look at work as this imposition, and we think our real fullness comes when we don't have to work. But that is belied by our very natures. Most people, when they retire, go bonkers if they don't have something to give them direction, because work is implicit in who we are. It's what we're built for. And so when we understand that, we begin to recognize that if work is what we're built to be, we live in a right relationship with work. And so Sabbath and work are not at odds, but they work together. This then has implications for eternity, because if we recognize work as part of what it means to be human, when we are fully human at the resurrection, I'm going to argue that we should expect to be working, but it won't be a burden. It'll be what it is when work clicks, when it's a delight. You're doing what you were created to do. Yeah. And some people, when they're doing their job and this is what I was built to do. Exactly. And that's what it's going to be like. We'll be working and be delighting in the work, and we'll be celebrating being with each other. There'll be times of just the delight and the festival. There's a great word here for that. And so I believe that's what eternity we can look forward to, is this kind of a beautiful blending of all these things together, as God always intended them to be, us being the creatures he created us to be.
So you picturing that, I think a lot of people might go, oh, work in heaven. Wow. But the way you describe it, of like, it'll be kind of amazing to realize, oh, I got that right. I love doing it.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's just,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Talk about, you use a Latin phrase in the book about how it's the Vita Receptiva, and it's been a long time since I've taken Latin. Tell us what that is, and then I think you mentioned that for those who might not be fans of the Latin phrases, you have that translated a bit in English for us. Tell us what this is and how it's important for us as creatures.
Yeah, in the Middle Ages, there was this kind of running debate that ran for centuries between two approaches to life, the Vita Activa and the Vita Contemplativa. And this played out even in the monasteries. You had mendicant monks who were very busy in the culture, and working, doing things. And they saw that their working was their way of being right with God. And so that was the Vita Activa. You get busy and do stuff, and plant gardens and help the sick and the dying and do things. Then you had the Vita Contemplativa. And that approach was, no. The purpose of human life is not activity and doing and working. The purpose of human life is contemplating God, using your reason, using your spirit to be engaged with God. And so now this is exemplified in, we're going to pray all day, sometimes literally, and we're going to worship, because worship is the highest thing we do. And so we're going to see how little work we can get it by with, so that we can actually pray and do the thing we're really built for. And that was the Vita Contemplativa. And they were always fighting in the Middle Ages, which one is right, which one's the dominant one, how do you figure this stuff out? Luther came along and basically said, no, it's not the Vita Activa, we don't earn it. But the Vita Contemplativa also kind of reduces down to something you're performing, and you're missing the point. And so he never used this phrase, but he talked about everything that goes in it. And the phrase I use is the Vita Receptiva, as you put it, the receptive life, a life that instead of doing or contemplating is just receiving what comes, and that God gives us the grace that we need. That's our heart to our Christian confession as Lutherans, especially, that we are justified by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone. It just comes to us. We just receive it. But then so does our working in this world. I'm born into a particular family, given particular things to do. My vocations aren't things I really by and large choose. They come to me. And when I receive those vocations and I receive the work God gives me to do, it's part of me being creature saying, okay, God, I'll do what you gave me to do. I'll do that. That's the Vita Receptiva. So we live life with this kind of openness, willing to receive what God gives. And to me, that really captures the essence of the Christian life, this receptive life. And so, yeah, the phrase I came up with in English is the down and out life, that God brings down all this grace to me and all these gifts and all this direction. And then I live my life out toward those around me, to my fellow creatures, love toward them, service to them. And so the life of the Christian is always a down and out life. God's grace comes down and I push it out to those around me. That's the heart of my living. That's the reason for my existence. That's what it's all about.
Before we end, I'm going to take us in a totally different direction for one last question. Early on, you mentioned your book, Holy Citizens. So as we are in the midst of election season, as we see all of this swirling around us, what encouragement do you have for our listeners as they're absorbing everything that this season of election is throwing at us?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, and I expect it every 4 years. This fascinating election cycle we got right now. My advice is sort of runs this way. Remember that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord. This is his creation. This is his world. He's in charge. Nothing happens outside his control. He is going to come when he decides it's time to come. He's going to make all things new. He's going to do that. We're his. We got nothing to worry about. And so in a sense, Christians need to sort of, and hear this the right way, back off the hyperbole and don't act like this is the end all be all. It's simply not. Now, having said that, we shouldn't check out. We are citizens of this world. We're creatures of this world. We have responsibilities. So we need to be involved and engaged, pay attention, vote, influence people to vote in ways that are going to bring things more nearly in line with God's purposes. And we should be doing that. But my goodness, the idea of this kind of rhetoric that gets just so ramped up, and even hear Christians talking about most important election, this and that, most significant. And yeah, it matters to be faithful, and it matters to be, doing what God gave us to do, but Jesus is Lord, and elections don't change that. And it doesn't matter who's sitting in the White House, Jesus is still Lord, and we can be confident of that. So I think we just need to back off a little bit and not get quite so worked up, would be my biggest piece of advice.
I think that's great advice. So for our listeners, visit the show notes. We'll have links to Dr. Biermann's book, Day 7 for Work, Rest, or Play. And I hope everybody takes a chance today to get some rest, to get some play, and to kind of think about what Sabbath means for us as full creatures. Dr. Biermann, thanks for being with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Concordia Publishing House Podcast. I pray that this time was valuable to your walk with Christ. We'd love to connect with listeners on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Concordia Pub. Visit cph.org for more resources to grow deeper in the gospel.